I'm excited to welcome you to the absolute best video on CSS Grid you're going to find anywhere on YouTube. This video is a comprehensive full course that covers every single detail you need to know to master CSS Grid. Unlike other tutorials that just talk over code, my teaching style is interactive and visual to ensure you remain engaged in order to maximize your learning. I use colorful diagrams and animations to break down the theory in an easy to understand way, as well as walk you through its application step by step in a real-world project. So let's jump in. Let's begin by exploring a powerful two-dimensional layout system with an introduction to CSS Grid. We'll be discussing what is CSS Grid, CSS Grid terminology, CSS Grid design guidance, and CSS Grid versus Flexbox. So what is CSS Grid? CSS Grid is a two-dimensional layout model, making it simple to arrange items in rows and columns. Now, the key difference between Flexbox and CSS Grid is that CSS Grid is two-dimensional, and it has rows and columns. If you don't know anything about Flexbox, you can check out my video in the description below. Let's take a look at an example of CSS Grid. On this page, you can see we have a 2x2 grid, and there are a total of 4 grid cells. We can see the first one here, the second one here, the third one here, and the fourth one here. This is an example of a two-dimensional layout which has rows and columns, where CSS Grid is used to achieve this. So let's start looking at some CSS Grid terminology. CSS Grid has two main components. We first have the grid container, which is the parent, and this is similar to the Flex container in Flexbox. And then we have grid items, which are the children, and this is similar to Flex items in Flexbox. So just like Flexbox has two main components of Flex container and Flex items, in CSS Grid, we have grid container and grid items. CSS Grid has two axes, and very different to Flexbox, we can't change the direction of the axes. The vertical axis is known as the column axis, and the horizontal axis is known as the row axis. The grid is divided into grid cells by grid lines. You can see vertically and horizontally, we have grid lines. And these grid lines divide our grid into grid cells. Now we actually number these grid lines like this. I'm going to start with our vertical grid lines at the top left. We would label the first one 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, and then 5. These numbers are very important for some properties we're going to be looking at later. Now we just numbered our vertical grid lines going from left to right. But you can also number them from right to left using negative numbers. Pay attention to the bottom right now. That is, on grid line 5, this is also -1. Moving to the left, we have -2, -3, -4, and -5. Let's now go number our horizontal grid lines. Paying attention to the top left, we're going to label the first horizontal grid line 1, then 2, and then 3. And now moving your attention to the bottom right, we're going to do the same thing with negative numbers, starting at -1, moving up to -2, and then -3. Now, as I mentioned, these grid lines define grid cells, which are shown in blue over here. So we can see our grid cell. Now, what's really important to note from the outset is that a grid item, which I've shown in green, isn't always the same size as a grid cell. You can see in my diagram, there's actually space inside the grid cell. And in fact, we're going to see later on, using some CSS Grid properties, we can move our grid item, that is the green box, inside the grid cell. And in fact, grid cells can have no grid items. So for example, the bottom left cell might not even have a grid item inside of it. So it's really important from the outset to distinguish between a grid cell, which is defined by grid lines, and a grid item, which is an actual piece of content. And some grid cells can be empty. That is, there is no content inside the grid cell. Now, grid lines define grid tracks. Grid tracks is just a fancy word for rows and columns. We can see our grid rows over here, where we effectively have 2 rows, a row over here, and a row over here. Looking now at our grid columns, we have 4 of these over here. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Grid rows and columns can have spacing between them. So you just saw our grid container expand vertically and horizontally. We still have our horizontal grid lines and our same grid rows in yellow, but now we have some space between our grid rows. Labeling our grid lines, we have horizontal grid line 1 Grid line 2, where there is now space between the grid lines, which we call horizontal gap. And then we have grid line number 3 on the edge of the grid container. Looking now at our vertical grid lines, we again have our grid columns shown in purple, and let's go label our vertical grid lines. We have grid line 1 on the edge of the grid container. Grid line 2 now has some vertical gap. Grid line 3 also has some vertical gap. Grid line 4 also has vertical gap. And grid line 5 is on the edge of the grid container. So let's have a look at CSS Grid on a web page. I'm on this page where you can see these cards are arranged in a grid, which has 2 rows and 3 columns. Let's open up DevTools, and if I select the main container, you can see CSS Grid is being applied. You can see our vertical and horizontal grid lines, which are defining our grid cells, which have inside of them content, which are the grid items. You can also see there's horizontal and vertical gap between the grid cells. So this is just one example of how you could use CSS Grid, and we're going to see many implementations of CSS Grid throughout this topic. So let's now take a look at how we can activate CSS Grid by using display grid. The display property on a container element will activate grid layout features on children elements. It's the exact same with Flexbox. We use the display property with the value grid. And just like Flexbox, the display property is declared on the grid container, the parent. Looking at values for display, we have block, inline, inline block, flex, and grid. So let's go play around with this inside VS Code. Alright, so I've gone ahead and created a new index.html file, which just has the boilerplate, and I've linked up an app.css style sheet, which is currently empty. Inside index.html, I'm going to go create a div. I'm going to give it the class grid container, which, as the name suggests, means this div will be our grid container. I'm then going to go add 8 grid children by adding 8 divs. I'm just going to pop the number 1 in the first div and give it a class of grid item 1. For the second div, I'll copy this class, pop it here, and change it to grid item 2 and give it the number 2. Now, to avoid boring you, I'm just going to repeat this pattern for all 8 divs. Alright, so we now have our 8 grid items inside our grid container. Let's now move over to app.css. I'm first going to grab the universal selector and just remove all default margin and padding. I'm going to grab our grid container, and I'm just going to give it a font size of 40 pixels. This means our grid items will inherit this font size, as it's being defined on the parent. We'll make the grid container into a grid by adding the display property with the value grid. We'll grab grid item 1, and I'm just going to give it a background color of red. I'll copy this style, change it to grid item 2, and give it a background color of green. Now again, to avoid boring you, I'm going to go add colors to the other grid items. So we have our 8 grid items, all with different background colors. So let's go check this out in the browser. Alright, so you can see our grid over here. By default, you'll see straight away that a grid just has one column, where our grid items are being stacked vertically on top of each other. We can confirm grid has been activated by opening up DevTools, selecting the grid container. You can see the word grid here, and you can also see the horizontal grid lines, which are those dashed purple lines. Now, if I go comment out, display grid, and refresh, you'll see there's actually no visual change, but this layout is not a grid. You can see inside DevTools, there's no grid appearing here, and there are no grid lines. We don't have those purple dashed lines. I'll just uncomment this again. I'll refresh, and you can see now our grid is back on with the grid lines reappearing. Now, throughout this topic, we're going to be using this setup to look at all the different properties for CSS Grid. But I do just want to highlight that by default, our grid items just appear in a single column. And we'll be seeing in the next chapter how we can use grid properties to get the two-dimensional layouts of rows and columns. So let's now take a look at some CSS Grid guidance. CSS Grid can be used for complex two-dimensional layouts. Looking at this page over here, if we were to see the grid, it would actually look like this. This is a very complex two-dimensional layout, where we have elements like text spanning grid cells. That is, our text is actually going across different grid cells. And you can see over here, we have images also spanning cells. So for this design, to achieve this interesting effect of images and text in a complex 2D layout, CSS Grid has to be used. Grid is also commonly used for major sections. This page has a very popular kind of layout, which would often be used for a feature section, with columns of alternating images and grouped text. You can see our 4 grid items over here. Grid is also commonly used for UI elements with consistent spacing in a one-dimensional row or column. Now you could also use Flexbox for this, and we are going to be seeing soon when to use Flexbox and when to use Grid. So here's what I mean. You can see these 3 cards are in a one-dimensional layout, but using Grid is actually fairly common. And we're going to see soon it's because we can easily divide a grid container into columns like this, where in this example, 3 columns are being used. So even though this is a one-dimensional layout, CSS Grid is being used with a single row and 3 columns. And this is actually a fairly common implementation. But of course, you can still use Flexbox. And if you were to look at DevTools at a layout like this, you'll see some pages use Flexbox and some pages use Grid. So it's kind of down to what you prefer. So when you're starting out, it can be quite confusing when to know to use Grid or Flexbox. So let's take a look at CSS Grid versus Flexbox and get a general idea of when you'd use each. Looking at Flexbox first, Flexbox is generally used for smaller UI. In CSS, we know it's defined like this, and it's a one-dimensional layout model in rows or columns. Examples of where we'd use Flexbox include navigation bars, footers, components, which would include things like buttons, text callouts, and inside cards. Flexbox is also used on hero sections and forms. These are good examples of one-dimensional layouts which tend to be smaller pieces of UI. Looking now at Grid, as a rule of thumb, this is used on larger UI. We know it's defined like this, and CSS Grid is a 2-dimensional layout model with rows and columns. Common places we'd see CSS Grid is in complex 2D layouts, like we saw earlier, with the images and text spanning different grid cells. It's also commonly used in large feature sections, where we saw an example of alternating images and grouped text in rows going down the page, and also used in cards, which could be in 2 dimensions or even in 1 dimension, like we just saw earlier. So as a general rule of thumb, Flexbox is used on smaller UI, and Grid is used on larger UI. And there are some cases where there is a bit of overlap where you could use Grid or Flexbox, just like those one-dimensional cards we looked at before. So let's wrap up this chapter by starting to build out the next summary card, CSS Grid Fundamentals. In this chapter, we looked at grid terminology. We saw that a grid has a grid container. Inside the grid container are our grid items. From top to bottom, we have our column axis, and from left to right, we have our row axis. And we discussed how these do not shift like in Flexbox. We then have our vertical grid lines, which are numbered from left to right 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And going the other way, we can also number them with negative numbers. Starting at the bottom right, we have -1, -2, -3, -4, and -5. We then have our horizontal grid lines. Looking in the top left, we number them 1, 2, and 3. And now looking in the bottom right, with the negative numbers, we go -1, -2, and -3. These are our grid lines. Our grid lines define our grid cells. And we also spoke about how a grid cell doesn't always have to have a grid item inside of it. And a grid item can also be smaller than a grid cell. And we're going to see later on some properties which allow us to align grid items inside of grid cells. Focusing on our grid container and our grid cells, we then spoke about grid tracks, which were defined by our grid lines, where we can have a grid row shown here and another grid row here. We then have a grid column defined by our vertical grid lines, which we can see here. And in this setup, we have this grid column here, here, and here. Between our grid rows and grid columns, we can have space. First looking horizontally, we call this horizontal gap, which is space between our grid rows. We can also have space between our grid columns, which we called vertical gap, and looks like this. Next, we'll learn how to structure layouts by defining tracks with grid columns and rows. We'll be talking about grid template columns and rows, the fractional unit, the repeat function, and grid column and row design guidance. So let's start off talking about grid columns and rows. Grid items will appear in a single column by default. We saw this in the previous chapter when we were playing around with CSS Grid. We added the display grid property. This defined a grid container, and we saw that all our grid items appeared by default in a single column, stacked one above another. the height of the grid container is the sum of the grid items. And because our grid items, we know the block element will extend the full width of the page or the container there inside. So this is our default setup. By adding display grid to a container, all children are converted to grid items, which by default will appear in a single column. So let's now look at how we can define columns in CSS with grid template columns. This is a CSS property that sets the number of columns and width of each. The property looks like this: grid-template-columns. And the values we use define the width of each column. So 100 pixels is the width of column 1, and 200 pixels is the width of column 2. So these two values are defining the width of the columns. Let's go play around with this inside VS Code. Alright, so I'm back inside the file we were playing around with in the previous chapter. We have our 8 grid items defined inside this grid container, which we previously put the display grid property on, converting this into a grid. And as I mentioned earlier, our grid items will just stack vertically by default in a single column. So let's go add the grid template columns onto our grid container. Let's make 2 columns, the first 100 pixels and the second column 200 pixels. I'll refresh and you'll see now that our grid has 2 columns. Let's open up DevTools. I'll select the grid container. Let's check out grid item 1, which is in the first column. So you can see from the box model, it has a width of 100 pixels. If I click on grid item 2, you can see it has a width of 200 pixels. The other thing I want you to note is that when I click on the grid container, you can see the purple dashed lines are defining the grid. So let's now take a look at grid template rows. This sets the number of rows and height of each. The CSS property looks like this: grid-template-rows. And similar to grid template columns, the values are now setting the height of each row. So row 1 will be 50 pixels, row 2 will be 100 pixels, row 3 is 200 pixels, and row 4 is 300 pixels. So each of these values are setting the height of each row. Let's go play around with this inside VS Code. Alright, so I'm back inside our file, and at the moment, the height of each row is just being defined by the height of the content itself. You'll also note that there are 4 rows, and this is happening because we earlier defined 2 columns. And because there are 8 grid items, it means that 2 grid items will appear per row. So that's why we end up with 4 rows. It's a result of having 8 grid items in 2 columns. But let's now go explicitly define our rows. We'll grab the grid template rows property. Let's still define 4 rows. The first row will set as 50 pixels, second row 100 pixels, third row 200 pixels, and fourth row 300 pixels. I'll refresh, and you can now see that the height of our rows is being explicitly defined by grid template rows. Now, as I mentioned earlier, when we didn't have the grid template rows property, we had 4 rows, and that was a result of having 8 grid items in 2 rows. But what I can do with the grid template rows property is also explicitly define the number of rows I want. So for example, let's go remove 300 pixels and just define 3 rows. I'll refresh. So now what's happening is that I'm explicitly defining only the first 3 rows, and grid items 7 and 8 are still in our grid container, but will just be their default height. Now in the earlier chapter, I mentioned that you can have grid cells which don't necessarily have to have grid items inside of them. So let me show you how we can end up in that situation. I'm going to come to our grid template columns and add an additional column of 300 pixels. So what this means is we now have 3 columns and 3 rows, and we only have 8 grid items. So let's see what happens when I refresh. You can see in our last row and last column, we have a grid cell with no grid item in them. And that's because we've defined 3 columns and 3 rows, which means that there's 9 cells. But we only have 8 grid items, so the last cell is empty. Let's check this out in DevTools. I'll select the grid container. And you can see in the bottom right, we have a grid cell with no grid item inside of it. You can also now see our grid lines appearing with the numbers we saw in the previous chapter. Alright, so we now have a good idea of how to define columns and rows in our grid. It's now time to talk about a special unit called the fractional unit, which you likely haven't seen before and is very commonly used in CSS Grid. The fractional unit defines the fraction of available space in the grid container, and we use it like this, where we have our property like grid template columns, and we define our columns using this fractional unit. Or in this case, I've defined 3 columns. The first is 1FR, the second is 3FR, and the third column is 4FR. So this is how it works. We have our grid container, which let's say has a width of 1000 pixels. We then add up our total fractions, which would be 1 plus 3 plus 4, which equals 8. We then take our width of 1000 pixels and divide it by our total fractions of 8, which gives us a value of 125 pixels. So we end up slicing our grid container into 8 fractions, each with 125 pixels. So essentially, one fraction is equal to 125 pixels. We then look back at the grid template columns values we decided. Our first column is 1 fractional unit, which we know is 125 pixels. Our second column is 3 fractional units, which would be 3 lots of 125 pixels, so that's 375 pixels. And our third column is 4 fractional units, which is 4 lots of 125 pixels, which is 500 pixels. So fractional units is an easy way to define our grid columns proportionally. Let's go play around with this inside VS Code. So I'm back inside the file we were working on earlier. I'm just going to go remove our grid template rows property and just go back to 2 columns we had before. So let's go use the fractional unit to define our columns. I'll remove the pixel values. Let's define our first column as 1 fractional unit and our second column as 3 fractional units. So let's open up DevTools so we can talk a bit more about what's happened. So if I select our grid container, now because our grid container is just a div, it will just extend the full width of the browser. Now by using fractional units, we're effectively dividing this space into 4, that is 1FR plus 3FR. And then our first column is 1/4, that is 1 fractional unit on the total of 4 in width. And our second column is 3 divided by 4, which is 3/4. So we've effectively divided our grid container into 2 columns, where the first column is 1/4 the width of the entire page, and the second column is 3/4 the width of the entire page. Now, one thing I want to show you, that this is technically the same thing as using percentages. I could change this to 25% and change this to 75%. I'll refresh, and you'll see there is no change. However, it's much more common to use fractional units when defining grid columns and rows. So I'm just going to change those back. Now, the last thing I want to show you is that at the moment, our grid container has no width. It's just extending the full width of the page. Let's now go set a width of our grid container of 400 pixels. I'll refresh, and now the fractional units are dividing the width of 400 pixels to define our columns. So the first column is 1/4 of 400 pixels, which is 100 pixels. And our second column is 3/4 of 400 pixels, which is 300 pixels. So I just wanted to show you that fractional units will define your columns proportionally based on the width, and that width could be the full width of the page if it's just a general block container, or it could be the width explicitly defined on the grid container. So let's now take a look at fractional units and rows. Now, fractional units and rows are just a little bit more tricky, and the behavior hugely depends on whether the grid container has a set height or not. So let's look at the first case. If height is set on a grid container, FR units proportionally distribute space to the grid items. This behavior is very expected. It's the exact same as what we saw with columns, just being applied to rows. So we have our CSS property, grid template rows, and we're defining 3 rows. The first one has 1 fractional unit, the second row 2 fractional units, and the third row also has 2 fractional units. Looking at this in diagram form, we have our grid container. Let's say its height is 1000 pixels. The total fractions is 1 plus 2 plus 2, which equals 5. So our grid container has 5 fractions, each with a height of 200 pixels. That is 1000 pixels, the height of the container, divided by 5, the total number of fractions, to give us 200 pixels. So these define our fractions of rows. Looking at grid template rows now, our first row we defined to have 1 fractional unit, so it will look like this, with a height of 1 fractional unit. Our second row is 2 fractional units, which would be 400 pixels. And our third row is also 2 fractional units, and also will have a height of 400 pixels. So let's go check this out in VS Code. So the first thing I want to do, just so we can look at the case I just went through, is I'm going to go add an explicit height on our grid container of 1000 pixels. Let's then go grab our grid template rows property, and let's define 4 rows. The first will be 1 fractional unit, the second 2 fractional units, the third 3 fractional units, and the fourth 4 fractional units. Let's refresh, and I'm going to zoom out quite a bit to see what's going on. So if we add up all our fractional units, 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 gives us 10 fractions. Because the height of our grid container is 1000 pixels, it means that each fraction will be 1000 pixels divided by the total fractions of 10, giving us 1 fraction equal to 100 pixels. So our first grid row, which is 1 fractional unit, will be 100 pixels. Our second grid row, which is 2 fractional units, will be 200 pixels. our third row 300 pixels, and our fourth row 400 pixels. So let's continue our discussion with fractional units and rows and look at the other case, which is if no height is set on the grid container, FR units use the height of the grid items to set height and space on the grid container. This is very unexpected, where the fractional units are being calculated by the height of the grid items. They're no longer dividing the height or width of the grid container. So let's see what this looks like. Let's say we define our rows like this: grid template rows, which will define 3 rows, row 1 of 1 fractional unit, row 2 of 3 fractional units, and row 3 of 4 fractional units. Looking in diagram form, we have our grid container, and let's say each grid item is 10 pixels. Now, as there's no height set on the grid container, the height of the grid container is the sum of the content, that is 30 pixels. Let's now move back to our fractional units. We'd calculate the total fractions, which would be 1 plus 3 plus 4, which equals 8. And what this now does is define 8 fractional units like this. We're no longer dividing the grid container in 8, but we're basing the fractional units on the height of the grid items. So we could then calculate what the new total height of our grid container will look like, which equals 10 pixels times 1 fractional unit, plus 10 pixels times 3 fractional units, plus 10 pixels times 4 fractional units, which equals 80 pixels. So this means the height of our grid container will be 80 pixels, where the grid container has now scaled based on the grid items. And our grid rows will now look like this. The first row is 1 fractional unit, which is 1 divided by 8, the total fractions, multiplied by 80 pixels, which would be 10 pixels. The second row, which is 3 fractional units, is 3 divided 8 times by 80 pixels, that is 3 fractions of 10 pixels. And our third row is 4 fractional units, which is 4 divided 8 times 80 pixels, which is 40 pixels. So this is just really strange behavior, where our grid container is actually expanding based on the height of our grid items and the different fractional units we're using. Now, this may seem incredibly overwhelming, and honestly, I wouldn't worry about it too much. We're going to see soon in the guidance that in most cases, we don't even use grid template rows, let alone grid template rows when there is no height on a grid container. Most of the time, we're just using grid template columns to define our columns, and the rows are just a result of the number of columns and grid items, where we don't actually go and explicitly define our grid rows. And I'll cover that in more detail soon, but I wanted to bring it up now because I imagine you're feeling very overwhelmed. And I seriously wouldn't worry too much about this. As always, I do just want to show you so you know everything that's going on, but honestly, don't stress too much about it. Alright, so let's check this out in VS Code. What I'm going to go do is now remove the height on our grid container. I'm just going to temporarily comment out our grid template rows. I'll refresh, and we're now back to a grid container of 400 pixels with our columns defined with 1 fractional unit and 3 fractional units. Okay, so our grid container has no set height, which means the height is being set by the height of our grid items. So the sum of these 4 grid items are setting the height. I'm going to uncomment this and refresh, and you'll see how our grid container has now expanded. So let's open up DevTools. You can see the height of this grid item is 46 pixels. Now, because our first row is 1FR, that means that 1FR is equal to 46 pixels. Now, if I add up our fractional units of 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4, that gives us 10 fractions. As 1 fractional unit is 46 pixels, it means our height of our grid container is now being set at 46 pixels times 10 fractional units, which gives us a height of 460 pixels, which you can see here when I click on grid container. And then each grid row is now defined by a multiple of our fractional unit, which is 46 pixels. If I click on grid item 3 in row 2, you can see it has a height of 92 pixels, 2 times 46 pixels. If I click on grid item 5 in row 3, its height of 138 pixels is 3 times 46 pixels. And grid item 7 in row number 4 has a height of 184 pixels, which is 4 times 46 pixels. So once again, just to summarize this, when you don't explicitly have a height on your grid container and you're using fractional units, the fractional units are calculated based off the height of the grid items. And as I mentioned earlier, I really wouldn't worry too much about this, but I do just want you to see how it works. So let's now take a look at the repeat function. The repeat function is a helpful tool which can be used to repeat rows or column dimensions when they are recurring. It looks like this, where we have our grid template columns or rows property, and we use this function called repeat. Inside the repeat function, we have 2 values. The first value is the number of rows or columns we wish to define, in this case 4 columns, and the second value is the size value, that is, the size we want our columns to be, in this case 1 fractional unit. So what this will give us is a grid with 4 columns, each 1 fractional unit in width. So it's just a cleaner way of defining 4 grid columns, each with the same width. You can of course define this as grid template columns, 1FR, 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 that is 1FR 4 times, but this function is just a nicer and cleaner way of defining it. So let's check this out in VS Code. So I'm back inside the file we've been working on. I'm going to go just remove grid template rows. At the moment, we have 2 columns. Let's go define 4 columns, each with 1 fractional unit. So the long way of doing it is like this, using 1FR 4 times. I'll refresh, and this defines us a grid with 4 columns, each 1 fractional unit. The width of our grid container is 400 pixels, so that means that each column will be 100 pixels. That is 1 divided by 4, where 4 is the total number of fractions, multiplied by the width. So instead of doing this, we can define it like this. Repeat, the first value is the number of columns we want, which is 4, and the second value is the width of our columns, which we're going to define as 1 fractional unit. I'll refresh, and you can see we end up with the same thing. Now you don't have to use fractions here, you can use other units. So let's say I define this as 200 pixels. I'll refresh, and you can now see that we have 4 columns, each 200 pixels wide. Alright, let's finally take a look at some column and row guidance. So the good news is the actual use of rows and columns is fairly simple in practice. Columns are often set with FR units, and the width of the grid container is usually not set, but extends the width of the page. Looking at this page as an example, we have 6 grid items here, which would all be defined in this grid container, where the grid container extends the full width of the page. We have the 6 grid items shown in green, and we have 3 columns, all with equal width, and would each have 1 fractional unit, which very simply defines 3 columns with equal width, each taking up 1/3 of the grid container. Now the number of rows are not usually set, but are automatically defined by the number of grid items. I touched on this earlier when you were likely freaking out about using grid template rows. As you can see here, the good news is we often don't even use it. We just define grid template columns and let the number of rows automatically fall into place by knowing our number of grid items and the number of columns we're defining. In this case, we have 3 columns with 6 grid items, which automatically creates our 2x3 grid. And finally, the height of the grid container is not usually set, but defined by the sum of the height of the grid items. It's very common when defining page sections or components not to actually set the height, but let the height be automatically determined by the height of the content. So the height of the grid container is the sum of the height of the content in the grid items. So our grid items contain things like images and text and anchor tags. So the height of each grid item would be the sum of those, and the height of the grid container would be the sum of the grid items. So let's wrap up this chapter by adding to our summary card CSS Grid Fundamentals. In this chapter, we looked at rows and columns. We saw how we could define columns with the CSS property grid template columns, and we also looked at fractional units, which are very commonly used in CSS Grid. For grid template rows, the CSS property looked like this, where we also saw we could use a repeat function, where the first value is the number of rows, and the second value, in this case, would be the height of each row of 200 pixels. These properties would then define our grid, which would look something like this, where we have 2 columns, where the width of the first column would be 1/3 the width of the grid container, the second column would be 2/3 the width of the grid container, and for the rows, we would have 2 rows, each with 200 pixels in height. And just as a final reminder, don't freak out too much about the use of grid template rows. We're mainly going to be using grid template columns and fractional units to define our grid and let our rows be automatically calculated. Now that you've mastered the theory so far in this video, it's important to understand how we can use it in a real-world web application. For this part of the video, I recommend you download the starter HTML and CSS files in the description below and code along with me. We will be working on the homepage for a major full-stack web application called Quill, which you can learn more about in the description below. This project is part of my CSS full course, where we build the Quill homepage from scratch. You can join me for free in my CSS full course on YouTube by clicking in the video appearing in the top right now. So let's now go ahead and start adding a grid to our Quill homepage. This section of the page, which has our features, will be defined inside a grid. we'll define a grid container, where the grid container width extends the full width of the page. We then have our grid items, which are either grouped text or an image. In our layout, we want 2 columns of equal width. So we will be using fractional units to define our columns, where each column will be 1 fractional unit. This will effectively divide our grid container to have 2 columns of equal width. Now, because we have 2 columns with 6 grid items, this automatically creates a 3x2 grid. That is, a grid with 3 rows and 2 columns. Let's add on our vertical grid lines and our horizontal grid lines. Now, one thing I want you to notice is that our text grid items have a different height to our images. So the height of the grid container is set by the height of the images. That's because in each row, the image has a larger height compared to the grouped text. So the image grid item is setting the height of each row, which means that the height of the entire grid container will be the sum of the heights of the images. Now, later on in this topic, we're going to be talking about alignment of grid items when there's extra space in the grid cell. So you can see, for example, our group text has been vertically centered inside each grid cell, and we're going to be looking later at how we can do that. Now, before we jump into VS Code, I do just want to point something out. This layout of alternating text and image as you move down the page is very common, and there are actually 2 ways of achieving this. The method we're doing is defining a grid for the entire section. Let me show you this on another page. Okay, I'm going to scroll down to the features section of this page, and you can see we have these alternating images and group text as we scroll down. I'm just going to zoom out quite a bit. I'm going to open up DevTools, and you can see we have a single grid defining this entire section. Now I want to contrast this to the implementation on this page. I'm going to scroll down, and you can see we have the same layout, where we have alternating text and image. I'm also going to zoom out quite a lot. I'm going to open up DevTools, and let's go select the grid. And what you'll notice is that each row is actually its own grid. We have a grid here, we have a separate grid here, if I scroll down, and we have a separate grid here. So I just wanted to show you this is another common way of implementing this. Now I've decided to go with this method, but do be aware this is another common implementation of defining separate grids for each row. So I'm back inside our index.html file for our Quill project. I'm going to scroll down to the features section. And before we start using the CSS Grid properties, we need to make some adjustments to our HTML. So at the moment, inside our section, we have our 3 features, each defined inside a div. Here's feature 1 with the heading, paragraph, and image. Feature 2, heading, paragraph, image. And feature 3 with the heading, paragraph, and image. So the first thing I want to do is just go define our grid container. I'm going to grab a new set of divs, and I'm going to give this the class of features grid container. Now, if I were to just copy and paste these divs for each feature back inside of here, this isn't going to work with the layout we want. And that's because inside our grid container, we would just have 3 grid items. This one here, and this one here. And what we need is 6 grid items, where we need to group our text for some of the grid items and just use the image as the other grid items. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get another div, and this will be used to group our text. I'll copy this and place it inside the div. So now we have our grid container with our first grid item, the grouped heading and paragraph inside this grid item, this div here. And the next grid item is just the image. I'll copy that and paste it over here. And I just need to repeat this same structure for the other feature sections. So I'll define another div for our group text for feature 2. I'll copy this and paste it here. I'll then grab the image for feature 2 and paste it here. Finally, I'll get the last group text from feature 3 over here. I'll copy that and paste it here. And then finally, I'll grab the image from feature 3. So this now gives us our grid container with 6 grid items. Grid item 1, which is the group text for feature 1. Grid item 2, which is the image for feature 1. Grid item 3, which is the grouped text for feature 2. Grid item 4, which is the image for feature 2. Grid item 5, which is the grouped text for feature 3. And grid item 6, which is the image for feature 3. So let's now go remove the original markup. Now I really don't want these divs over here to throw you off. The div here is just a child of our grid container, no different to the image. So that's why the entire div is the grid item, where inside the div we have some text. So once again, we have 6 grid items. This one here, 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 and this one here. Heading over to app.css, let's go down to our features section over here. And under the features main heading, I'm going to go grab our features grid container. We'll change the display property to grid. And let's go define our grid template columns. And as we said, we're going to define 2 columns, each with the width of 1 fractional unit. Now I've defined it like this. You could also use the repeat function, but because this is 2 columns, I'm just going to use this implementation. So let's check this out in the browser. Now before I refresh, this is what the page originally looked like, where we have our feature section with text and image repeated. Now in our markup, we've now grouped this text, so that's 1 grid item, and our image is another grid item. So I'll refresh, and you'll now see we have 2 columns where our grid items is group text and an image, and each column is 1 fractional unit. Let's open up DevTools. I'll select this div with the class features grid container. I'll zoom out a bit, and you can see our grid in all its glory, where inside each grid cell, we either have group text or the image. And as I mentioned earlier, the height of this grid container is being defined by the height of each image. You'll also notice that inside each grid cell, there's actually some space for our content to move. In the grid cells with our text, you can see there's some vertical space here. And in the grid cells with our image, you can see there's horizontal space. And we're going to soon be learning about grid alignment properties that allow us to move grid items inside grid cells when there is space. The other thing I want to mention is that in our final design, the text and images alternate as you move down. You can see that's not happening here, where in the second row, we want the image on the left and the text on the right. Now, one way of fixing this is going to the underlying HTML and changing the order of the second feature. I could take this image and put it above the group text for feature 2. I'll refresh and you'll see this corrects this. However, this is not a good implementation. Let me just change it back. There's actually 2 reasons why it's not a good implementation. The first is we want to keep our HTML markup consistent, where we first have our group text and then image for each feature. This is much cleaner and much more consistent. The second reason, which is more important, is later on when we make this page responsive using media queries, it's going to make it a lot easier having our grid items defined like this. You can learn more about responsive design and media queries in my video in the description below. So to correct this, we are going to learn about a property later on, which allows us to manually define the position of a grid item. Now it's time to learn about how to create spacing between grid items using grid gap. We'll be discussing default spacing between grid items, the gap property, and gap design guidance. So let's first talk about the default spacing between grid items. By default, grid items are placed next to each other with no spacing between them. Looking at an example grid, we have our grid container, and we have our different grid items. In this case, a grid which is 2 rows by 3 columns. And you'll notice by default, there is no spacing between any of the grid items. They butt up right next to each other. Let's take a look at this inside VS Code. So this is the file we were working on in the previous chapter. I want to go update it to just have 2 columns. So I'm going to do 1FR and 1FR. I'll refresh, and we're now back to having 4 rows and 2 columns. I'm going to zoom in a bit, and as you can see, our grid items all butt up right next to each other. There is no spacing between them. If I open up DevTools and select the grid container, you can see those dashed grid lines, which act as a border between the grid items. So by default, there is no spacing between our grid items. Now this is a fairly simple example, and I actually want us to get more familiar with thinking about grid cells as opposed to grid items when it comes to spacing. So to better understand what I mean, I've gone ahead and prepared this file ahead of time. I've got a simple div, which I've given the class grid container, and I have 8 images inside. In app.css, I've gone ahead and removed margin and padding, and on the grid container, I've converted this into a grid. I've given it 2 equal columns of 1FR and 1FR, and I've given the entire grid a width of 1000 pixels. So let's check this out in the browser. So you can see I have 8 different images of my favorite satirical character Borat, each with different sizes. You can see they're in a grid with 2 columns and 4 rows. Let's open up DevTools, and you can see the grid here with the grid lines. Now the reason I want to get more comfortable with thinking about grid cells as opposed to grid items is that when we're talking about gap, we're talking about space between rows and columns, which is space between our grid cells. So you can see, for example, inside this grid, this image, which is a grid item, is inside this top left grid cell. and you can see that there's space inside that grid cell for this grid item to move. We'll be looking at how we do that in the next chapter. But what I really want you to get comfortable with is that the spacing we're going to be looking at now is between grid cells, not grid items. It can be that your grid item is the same size as your grid cell, like in the simple example we looked at earlier, but that's not always the case. So I just wanted to make a note about that from the outset, that the spacing in this chapter we're talking about is spacing between our grid cells. So for the rest of this chapter, I'm no longer going to be talking about grid items, but rather grid cells. So let's now take a look at the gap property. The gap property creates space between grid rows and columns. Here's our flex container. In blue, we now have our grid cells, and we can use the property row-gap, which will create space between our rows. And in this case, the space will be 20 pixels. And we can also use the CSS property column-gap to create space between our grid columns. In this case, a space value of 40 pixels. So let's play around with this inside VS Code. Alright, so I'm back in the file we were working on earlier. Now the first thing I want to do before we go add some gap is look at the size of our grid cells. If I click on this grid cell, you can see it's currently 200 pixels wide by 46 pixels high. Let's now go add some row gap of 20 pixels. I'll refresh. You can see now that between our rows, there's 20 pixels of gap. Now because there was no height set on this grid container, to account for the additional 20 pixels between each row, the entire grid container has effectively expanded. And you can see the height of our grid items are unchanged. They're still 46 pixels high. I also want you to notice that in the CSS Grid model in DevTools, our grid line, like this one here, number 3, now actually appears as 20 pixels wide, whereas grid line 1 is just in one dimension. It has no width. I'm going to exit DevTools just so you can clearly see the row gap of 20 pixels between each row. I'm going to open up DevTools again and select the grid container. Now let's go add column gap. And this time, I want you to keep an eye on the width of our grid cells, which are currently 200 pixels wide. This is being set by the width of the grid of 400 pixels. And because there's two columns, each with one fractional unit, it results in the columns being 200 pixels wide. So let's go add some column gap of 40 pixels. I'll refresh, and you can now see we have 40 pixels of column gap. But the big thing you'll notice here is that the width of the cell has actually reduced. It was 200 pixels and has now gone to 180 pixels. So what this means is that if you have a set dimension on either width or height, if you add column or row gap, it will reduce the width or height of the content. Now in most cases, you won't have a height set, so your grid container will just expand in height, whereas with width, you'll either have a width set, like 400 pixels, or it will just expand the full width of the page. So to show you this, let me turn this off. I'm going to comment out column gap. I'll refresh. Our grid items are currently 310 pixels wide. Let's go add our column gap back in. I'll refresh, and you'll now see, to account for the additional column gap of 40 pixels, our grid items have reduced to 290 pixels. So long story short, in most cases, when it comes to the width of a grid container, it will either be explicitly set, or it will just extend the full width of the page. And in both those cases, adding column gap will reduce the width of your grid item. Now with height, in most cases, you will not set an explicit height on the grid container, which means that when you add row gap, the height of your grid container will just expand to account for the additional space between your rows. Now once again, I really want to stress that the row and column gap we've just looked at is spacing between grid cells. So I'm back in our Borat collage. Just going to open up DevTools. Let's go add row gap of 50 pixels and column gap of 100 pixels. I'll refresh. I'll select the grid container, and I want you to once again see that the spacing is between our grid cells, and it's our grid cells that make up columns and rows. So for example, the spacing is not the spacing between this flex item and this flex item. It's the spacing between this entire grid cell and this grid cell. And as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be looking at the next chapter at how we can move our grid items inside grid cells when there is space like this inside the grid cell. Now the other thing I just want to note before we move on is that row gap and column gap is not created on the perimeter. So for example, in this grid, you can see there's no column gap on the far left and on the far right. It's only down here. And the same for row gap. There's no row gap right at the top and right at the bottom. It's only between our actual rows. Now another version of the gap property you can use is the simple property gap with a value like 40 pixels. And this value is the value for the row and column gap set in one go. So for example, in our grid container, we have our grid cells, our row gap is 40 pixels, and our column gap is also 40 pixels. So if you're using an equal value for both row and column, you can simply use the gap property. So let's now take a look at some gap guidance. Gap is commonly used to space grid items in major sections. We can see over here a typical feature section with alternating images and group text. I'm going to lay over the grid cells. We can see over here some large row gap, and over here some smaller column gap. Gap is also commonly used for spacing in card layouts such as testimonials and features. Looking at this example here, we have our grid cells, we have row gap and column gap. So there are many instances where you do want to be using gap inside your grid layout. So let's now finish off the summary card, CSS Grid Fundamentals. In this chapter, we looked at gap. We saw the CSS property row-gap and the CSS property column-gap. We saw that these properties create gap between our grid cells. For row gap, the value is 40 pixels. That is 40 pixels between our rows inside our grid. And for column gap, the value is 20 pixels. That is 20 pixels between our columns inside our grid container. We also looked at the gap property, which sets a gap value for both rows and columns at the same time. So in this example, a gap of 20 pixels will set 20 pixels of space between our rows and 20 pixels of space between our columns. So let's now go and apply column and row gap to our Quill homepage. So far, we've established a grid container with our grid cells in a 3x2 layout. We're going to go ahead and add some row gap between our rows and some column gap between our column. So let's jump into VS Code and add this to our project. So I'm back inside our app.css file for the Quill homepage. Now before we go add some values, I want you to see that our rows are really quite on top of each other. We really do want to create quite a bit of space between each of these rows to improve the visual aesthetic. We're also going to add a small value of column gap to just spread these out a bit more. Now ordinarily, you'd go play around with values until you feel like the page looks right. I played around before, and for me, a row gap of 15 rem, which in our project is 150 pixels, and a column gap of 5 rem, which is 50 pixels, look good for me. Now, if you don't know anything about rem values, you can check out my video in the description below. I'm going to refresh, and you can see this creates more vertical spacing between our different features, which just seems a bit more consistent with the layout we have. And as I mentioned, I just think this spacing looks good. But you, of course, can go add whatever spacing you like. Now, just to see the row and column gap in action, let's open up DevTools. I'll select the grid container, and you can see the column and row gap with the purple dashes. Now, the other thing I just want to mention before we finish up is that the values I picked here, 15 rem and 5 rem, are still part of our spacing system we defined much earlier. 5 rem is equivalent to 50 pixels, and 15 rem is equivalent to 150 pixels. So whatever values we pick for our spacing should still fall in line with the spacing system we established earlier on in the project. Moving on, we'll explore how to position content within individual grid cells using grid alignment. We'll be discussing the Justify Items property, the Align Items property, and grid cell alignment design guidance. So what is grid cell alignment? This is where grid items can be aligned inside grid cells if there is space available. So let's take a look at this on this page here. We have our grid container and our 2 grid items. I'm going to add in our horizontal grid lines and our vertical grid lines. You can see that the height of the grid is set by the height of the image. This means that on the left, there's space inside the grid cell, as the grouped text, which would be inside a div, is not the same height as the image on the right. So there's space above and below for this grid item to move inside the grid cell. So let's check out the first property, Justify Items. Just a note, this is not Justify Content, which we saw in Flexbox. Justify Items aligns grid items inside a grid cell along the row axis. The CSS property looks like this, where at the moment the value start is being used. Looking at this in diagram form, we have our grid container, our vertical grid lines, and horizontal grid lines. The grid lines define our grid cells, and inside the grid cells we have our grid items. So you can see in this setup, there's space for our grid items to move inside the grid cell along the row axis. So this is where we could use Justify Items to align the grid items. Now there are 4 possible values we can use. The first value is Justify Items Start, which we just looked at earlier. and we'll align our grid items at the start of each cell along the row axis. The next value is justify items end. We have our grid container, and along the row axis, our grid items are at the end of each grid cell. The next value, justify items center. We have our grid container, and along the row axis, our grid items are in the center of their grid cell. And the final value is justify items stretch. And this is in fact the default value. We have our grid container, and along the row axis, our grid items are stretching the full width. So let's play around with this inside VS Code. So I'm back inside the app.css file we were playing around with in the previous chapter. So let's go add our justify items property to see it in action. Like all the other properties we've seen so far, justify items is set on the grid container. And the first value I want to use is the default value stretch. I'll refresh and you see nothing changes. And that's because the grid item is being stretched inside the grid cell. You can see the number 1 only takes up this width of content. And because I've added a background color, you can see the background color has been fully stretched inside the grid cell. Let's go look at the other values. We saw start. I'll refresh, and you can see the grid item is now only occupying its actual width and is at the start of the grid cell. Let's check this out in DevTools. You can see our grid container with the grid lines now appearing, and you can see inside each grid cell, the content, which is just the number 1 inside a div with some background color, is at the start of the grid cell. The next value we looked at was end. I'll refresh, and you can see the grid item now moves to the end of the grid cell along the row axis. And the final value we looked at was center. I'll refresh, and this now centers our grid item inside the grid cell along the row axis. So now let's take a look at the align items property. This property is the same as what we're using in Flexbox. Now by now, I'm sure you're getting a bit overwhelmed with the different alignment properties flying around, where some are used on Flexbox, some are used on Grid, some are not. In the next chapter, I'm going to be doing a side-by-side comparison of the different alignment properties to help summarize what we're using where. But just stick with me for now. The align items property aligns grid items inside a grid cell along the column axis. The CSS property looks like this, where at the moment, the value start is being used. Looking at this in diagram form, we have our grid container, our vertical grid lines, our horizontal grid lines, and these define our grid cells. We then have our grid items inside the grid cells, and along the column axis, these grid items are at the start of their grid cell. So let's now take a look at the different align items values. We have align items start, where our grid items appear at the start of the grid cell along the column axis. We have align items end, where our grid items appear at the end of the grid cells along the column axis. We have align items center, where our grid items appear in the center of the grid cell along the column axis. And we have align items stretch, which again is the default value, and where our grid items will stretch the full height of their grid cell along the column axis. So let's go play around with this inside VS Code. Okay, I'm back inside the app.css file. I'm just going to go remove justify items center, so we can focus on the align items property. I'll refresh, and we know by default, our grid items will stretch the full width of the grid cell along the row axis. Now, at the moment, applying align items with a value like start won't do anything. And that's because our grid item currently is the same height as the grid cell. Just checking this out in DevTools. Our grid item is setting the height of the grid cell, so there is no space along the column axis to align the grid item. Now for this to work, I need to go add some height onto our grid container. Let's go add 500 pixels. It's also going to be easier to see the effect of align items if I just comment out the gap. So I'm going to do that and refresh. Let me just comment out align items. And you can see by default, our grid item is now stretching the height of the grid container. If I add align items back in and set its value to stretch, which is the default value, you'll see there's no change. Let's go play around with the different values now. I'm going to change this to start. You'll see that the grid item now appears at the start of each cell along the column axis. Let's change it to end. To better see this, let's open up DevTools. You can see that each grid item is now aligned at the end of each grid cell along the column axis. And the final value is center, where you can see the grid item is centered inside the grid cell along the column axis. And just like Flexbox, you can of course use these properties together. So let's go set justify items to a value like end. I'll refresh, and you can now see our grid item is at the end of the grid cell along the row axis and is in the center of the grid cell along the column axis. So let's now take a look at some grid alignment guidance. It is common to use grid alignment properties when one grid item is larger than another. Looking at this web page here, this content is inside a grid container. We have our 2 grid items. I'm going to add in the horizontal grid lines and vertical grid lines, and you can see the image sets the height of the container. So align items is used to center this grid item along the column axis. Let's go check out an example of this. So on this page, I'm going to scroll down to this section here, where we have a grid layout. I'm going to open up DevTools, and I'll select the grid. You can see this image on the left is setting the height of this row. And the group text on the right, which is the other grid item, has a height smaller than the image on the left, which means that there's space for this grid item to move along the column axis. Looking at the CSS properties, you can see align item center is being used. If I turn this off, you'll see the content moves to the top. Now, we know the default value is stretch, so if there was background color on this grid item, you would see that background color be the same height as the image. But this is a great example of where we're using the align items property to center a grid item when the other grid item sets the height. Moving on to the next piece of guidance, it is common to use grid and flexbox in parallel to achieve more precise control of layout. Looking at this page as an example, all of this content would be inside a grid container with our grid items. I'm going to add in our grid lines, and for this layout, grid controls the overall structure. But now instead of using grid alignment properties, we can use flexbox inside the grid items, where flexbox controls the alignment inside the grid item. Our grid item would essentially be turned into a flex container, where we would have these 2 flex items. And then we can use the flex properties for spacing and alignment, as well as properties like gap. So let's see an example of this in the browser. So on this page, I'm going to scroll to the bottom, and we have this review section over here. I'm just going to zoom out a bit. I'm going to open up DevTools. I'll select this section. You can see it's a grid, which is controlling the overall structure of this section. If I expand this, you'll see each grid item is a flex container, where flexbox is being used for precise controlling of the flex items. And the same thing for the grid item on the right. This is also a flex container, where once again, flexbox properties can be used for precise alignment. So let's build the next summary card, grid cell alignment. In this chapter, we looked at the 2 grid cell alignment properties. The first was justify items, which aligns content inside a grid cell along the row axis. We saw there were 4 possible values. The first was start, where our grid items are at the start of the grid cell along the row axis. There was end, where our grid items are at the end of our grid cell along the row axis. There was center, where our grid items were centered inside the grid cell along the row axis. And then there was stretch, which was the default value, and our grid items stretched the full width of the grid cell along the row axis. The second property we looked at was align items. This aligns content inside a cell along the column axis. The first value we looked at was start, where our grid items were at the start of each grid cell along the column axis. The next value was end, where our grid items were at the end of each grid cell along the column axis. The next value was center, where our grid items were centered inside the grid cells along the column axis. And the final value was stretch, which is the default value, and is where our grid items stretch the full height of the grid cell along the column axis. So let's go use the grid alignment properties on our Quill homepage. We have our grid container and our grid items. We've already established some vertical gap and some horizontal gap. So to achieve the layout we want here, we need to go position our grid items inside the grid cell. Now, just like the other examples we've seen throughout this chapter, the image is setting the height of each row. This then creates space along the column axis, that is vertically, for our grouped text. So align items is used to center the grouped text inside the grid cell vertically. Now, the width of our image is also less than the width of each grid cell. In our project, we're using the fractional unit to define our columns based on the full width of the page. Now, for our desired design, we want to center our image horizontally inside each grid cell. And because there's space to move horizontally, that is along the row axis, justify items is used to center the image horizontally. So let's go add this to our project. Alright, so I'm back inside our app.css file for the Quill homepage. We have our grid properties here inside the CSS file, and you can see the grid on the features section over here. I'm going to open up DevTools so we can see what's happening with our grid cells. Now, for the height of each row, the image is setting the height, which means that for the group text on the left, there's vertical space for the group text to move vertically along the column axis. Inside the grid cell on the right, because our grid container is expanding the full width of the page, and the columns are using fractional units, means that there's space inside the grid cell horizontally, so our image can move along the row axis. Let's first go center our image horizontally along the row axis using the justify items property. I'll grab justify items and set its value to center. I'll refresh, and you'll see the image has now centered horizontally inside the grid cell along the row axis. Now, of course, justify item center is being applied to every single grid cell because it's set on the grid container. We just don't see the effect of this on the text because the text is currently expanding the full width of the grid cell. So there is no space for the text to move. Let's now vertically center our text using align items. We'll set its value to center, and I'll refresh. And you'll see now our text is nicely vertically centered inside the grid cell. And once again, align item center is also applying onto our image, but because the image is setting the height of the container, there is no additional height for our image to move up and down along the column axis. So align item center has no impact. All right. Let's go check out our page in full screen. So this is starting to look great. Each text is now vertically centered, giving nice visual balance between the image and text, and each image is also centered horizontally inside its grid cell. Let's now continue by learning about how to align the entire grid structure within its container using grid alignment. We'll be discussing the justify content property, the align content property, and items versus content. So what is grid alignment about? Entire grid tracks can be aligned and distributed when there is extra space in the grid container. Looking at this in diagram form, we have our grid container, our grid items. I'm going to add in our grid lines. We have our grid rows, and we have our grid columns. Now, grid alignment is about how we can move the grid tracks, that is, the rows and columns, when there's extra space inside the grid container. This is different to grid cell alignment we looked at in the previous chapter, which was about aligning grid items inside grid cells. The grid alignment, we're moving the entire grid, that is, the different grid tracks, inside the grid container when the grid container has extra space. Now, as a general rule of thumb, I will say that grid cell alignment, what we looked at in the previous chapter, is a bit more commonly used than grid alignment, as it isn't too often your grid container is larger than your actual grid. But for completeness, we do need to cover this. So let's take a look at the first alignment property, which is justify content. And this is the same property as we've seen in Flexbox. It's just now being used in the context of grid. Justify content in CSS Grid aligns entire grid columns along the row axis. So in CSS, it looks like this. The property justify content, which is the same as we've seen in Flexbox with a value like space evenly. Looking at this in diagram form, we have our grid container, our grid items. I'm going to add in the horizontal grid lines. And I'm just going to overlay the grid columns over our grid items. So the justify content space evenly property is aligning our grid columns, shown in red, along the row axis. So let's now take a look at all the different justify content values. They're actually the exact same as what we've seen earlier in Flexbox. We have justify content start, which is the default value. We have our grid container, and our grid columns would be at the start of the row axis. The next value, justify content end, where our grid columns are at the end of the row axis. Justify content center, where we have our grid columns centered along the row axis. The next value, justify content space between, places the far left and far right grid columns right up against the edge of the grid container, and any remaining grid columns are inserted with equal space between them. For justify content space around, the grid container is essentially divided into 4 equal horizontal sections, and the grid columns are then inserted inside. So we end up with equal spacing between our grid columns and half the spacing between the far left and far right grid columns and the edge of the grid container. The last value, justify content space evenly, is when there's just equal spacing between each grid column and the edges of the grid container. So let's go play around with these inside VS Code. Alright, so I'm back inside the app.css file we were playing around with in the previous chapter. The first thing I'm going to do is just go remove the align items and justify items property, which we know has to do with alignment of grid items inside grid cells. So we don't need those properties for this chapter, so I'll remove those and refresh. I'm also just going to clean this up a bit. I want to get rid of these gap properties. Now, in order to demonstrate grid alignment, we need to set up our grid So our grid rows and columns have space to move inside the grid container. So in order to do that, we need to make a few modifications. I'm just going to update this height to 800 pixels, and I'm also just going to uncomment the width and change its value to 800 pixels. So now we're working with a grid container with a width and height of 800 pixels. I'm going to also give the entire grid container a background color of black so we can see it. I'll refresh, and let's talk about what's happened. Because our columns are being defined with fractional units, it just means that the width of each column is going to automatically calculate as 50% the width of the grid container. So each of these grid columns are each 400 pixels wide. Because we're not using grid template rows to explicitly define the number and height of rows, the number of rows is automatically calculated based on the number of grid items, which is 8, and number of columns, which is 2. So the result is 4 rows. Because we're not explicitly defining any height, it appears as if each grid item is the full height of the row. Now we know from the previous chapter what's actually happening is that the align items property has the default value of stretch. So if I refresh, you'll see no change. But if I change this to a value like start, you can see the black grid container appearing in the background, where the grid item is just the height of the content. But you can see the actual grid row is being automatically calculated as the height of 800 pixels divided by the number of rows, which is 4. So the height of each row is 200 pixels. I'm just going to go remove the align item start. And what I now want to do is actually go and explicitly define grid template columns and grid template rows in pixels, so that I can ensure our rows and columns have a width and height smaller than the grid container. So let's go update this to 100 pixels and 100 pixels. And you'll now see our columns are only 200 pixels wide, leaving 600 pixels of space along the row axis. Let's also go define grid template rows. We'll keep it as 4 rows, each with a height of 100 pixels. I'll refresh. So we now end up having our grid rows with a height of 100 pixels, meaning the total height of the grid container is now 400 pixels, which means that there's 400 pixels of space along the column axis. So in summary, I've just gone and defined specific heights and widths of our columns and rows, which is less than the width and height of the entire grid container. And this puts us in a position where we now have space along the column axis and the row axis for our grid columns and rows to move. So let's go play around with the justify content property. We'll set the first value to start, which is just the default value, so there's no change. Our grid columns are at the start of the row axis running from left to right. Let's update this to end, and you'll see our grid columns shift to the right. That is the end of the row axis. The next value is center. I'll refresh, and you can see our grid columns are centered inside the grid container along the row axis. The next value was space between. I'll refresh, and you can see our grid columns move to the far left and far right, and if there was a third column, it would appear in the middle. The next value is space around. Because we have 2 columns, this effectively splits our grid container into 2, down the middle vertically, and then inserts our grid columns in the middle of each column. The final value was space evenly. I'll refresh, and this now creates even space between our grid columns and the edges of the grid container. Let's now take a look at align content. And again, this is the same property used in Flexbox, but now applied in CSS Grid. Align content aligns entire grid rows along the column axis. In CSS, it looks like this, align-content with a value like center. In diagram form, we have our grid container, we have our grid rows. I'm going to add in the vertical grid lines, and align content distributes our grid rows along the column axis. So let's take a look at the align content values. We have align content start, which is the default. And in diagram form, it looks like this, where our grid rows are positioned at the start of the column axis. We have align content end, where our grid rows are at the end of the column axis. We have align content center, where our grid rows are centered along the column axis. We have align content space between, which pushes our top and bottom grid rows to the top and bottom edge of the grid container, with any additional grid rows spaced evenly between these. We have align content space around. This will divide our grid container into 2 horizontally, and then we'll insert our grid rows in the middle of those 2 sections. The final value is space evenly, which creates even space between our grid rows and the top and bottom edges of the grid container. So let's go play around with these inside VS Code. Alright, so I'm back in the file we were just working on earlier. I'm going to go just comment out the justify content property and refresh. Let's go grab our align content property, and let's first look at the value start. This is the default value, so we're not going to see any changes. And by default, we know that our rows will appear at the start of the column axis running from top to bottom. Let's change this value to end. I'll refresh, and you can see our rows now move to the end of the column axis, which is at the bottom. The next value is center. I'll refresh. This centers our grid rows along the column axis. The next value is space between. I'll refresh. This pushes our top and bottom rows right to the top and bottom edge of the grid container, and then equally spaces any grid rows between these. The next value was space around. I'll refresh. This essentially divides our grid container into 4 equal rows, and then inserts the grid row inside each of those sections. This means we end up with 2 times the amount of spacing between our different grid rows compared to the edge of the grid row and the edge of the grid container. The last value was space evenly. I'll refresh, and this creates equal space between our grid rows and the edge of the grid container. Now, I know throughout this topic, we've seen a lot of alignment properties when it comes to grid. So I do want to quickly summarize the differences of the properties, items, and content. Looking at the items properties first, we have justify items and align items. And these are more commonly used in CSS Grid. These properties align grid items when grid cells have extra space inside of them. Along the row axis, we use justify items, and along the column axis, we use align items. The values that each of these can take include start, end, center, and stretch. In diagram form, it looks like this. We have our grid container, our grid lines, and let's say we apply the properties justify items center and align items end. We end up with our grid items inside our grid cells looking like this, where along the row axis, that is horizontally, justify items is centering our grid items inside the grid cell, and along the column axis, that is vertically, align items end is placing the grid item at the end of the grid cell. So justify items and align items are about aligning grid items inside grid cells when the grid cells have extra space. For the content properties, we have justify content and align content. This aligns grid tracks when the grid itself has extra space. Along the row axis, we have justify content, and along the column axis, we have align content. For the values that justify content and align content can take, include start, end, center, space around, space evenly, and space between. Looking at an example of this, we have our grid container, and let's say we applied justify content center and align content end. This would mean that our columns are centered along the row axis, which is being defined by justify content center, and our rows are at the end of the column axis, being defined by align content end. Now, justify content and align content only work when the grid container itself has space, so that the rows and columns can move around. This is very different to the properties justify items and align items, which is about the movement of grid items inside grid cells. Now, as I'm sure you're aware, we also use some of these properties in Flexbox. So when it comes to Flexbox, align items, justify content, and align content can be used, where justify items is specific to grid. Just as a quick reminder, align items aligns flex items along the cross axis, justify content aligns flex items along the main axis, and align content is only used when our flex items wrap onto separate lines. So let's now wrap up this chapter with a new summary card, grid container alignment. We first looked at the justify content property, which aligns grid columns along the row axis when there is extra space inside the grid container. The different values we looked at include justify content start, which is the default value, and looks like this, where our grid columns, shown in red, are at the start of the row axis. The next value was justify content end, where our grid columns are at the end of the row axis. We then had justify content center, where our grid columns are centered along the row axis. The next value was space between, where our far left and far right grid columns are pushed right up against the grid container, and any grid columns between these will have equal spacing. The next value was space around. This essentially divided our grid container into 3 separate columns, and then inserts our grid columns in the center of these. So we end up with double the spacing between our grid columns compared to the grid columns on the far left and far right and edge of the grid container. For space evenly, this simply creates even space between our grid columns and the left and right edge of the grid container. along the row axis. The next value we looked at was align content. This aligns grid rows along the column axis when there is extra space inside the grid container. It's the same values as justify content. We have align content start, which is the default value. This positions our grid rows at the start of the column axis. Align content end, which positions our grid rows at the end of the column axis. Align content center, which positions our grid rows in the center of the column axis. Align content space between, which pushes our top and bottom grid rows to the top and bottom of the grid container along the column axis, and any additional rows would have equal space between these. Align content space around divides the grid container into 2 equal rows, and then inserts the grid rows in the middle of these rows. This results in double the space between the grid rows and the top and bottom edge of the grid container and the top and bottom grid row. The final value space evenly creates equal space between the grid rows and the top and bottom edges of the grid container along the column axis. Now in our Quill project, we won't be applying these properties because our grid doesn't have any extra space. And it actually is fairly common in most web design for there not to be additional space to move the grid around. And that's why I mentioned the justify items and align items properties, which move grid items inside grid cells when there's extra space inside the grid cells, is a lot more commonly used. In the final chapter, we'll look at how to control the placement and behavior of elements inside a grid with grid items. We'll be discussing placing grid items, spanning grid cells, and aligning grid items. So let's first talk about placing grid items. Grid items are automatically placed in a grid based on the order they appear in the HTML. Let's look at some example HTML, where we have 6 grid items inside a grid container. In the CSS file, in the grid container class, we've activated grid with display grid, and given this grid 3 columns, each 1 fractional unit. In diagram form, we have our grid container, and our grid items are going to be positioned based on their order in the HTML, where the HTML order is going from top to bottom. So by default, our grid items are positioned like this. In the first row, we have grid item 1, grid item 2, and grid item 3, going from left to right. And in the second row, we have grid item 4, grid item 5, and grid item 6, going from left to right. So by default, grid items fill up from left to right, row by row. Now, grid items can be moved to different cells. Let's go add on our grid lines and see how this works. I'm going to be moving grid item 6. That is the grid item in the bottom right corner. We can use the grid row property, which is grid-row, and the value is 1/2. So what is this value? The 1 corresponds to the start line, and the number 2 corresponds to the end line. This is the start and end line of where grid item 6 will be positioned in relation to the row, because this is the grid row property. Importantly, grid row is set on the grid item, that is specifically on grid item 6. So by setting this, grid item 6 moves to this row. That's because this row starts at 1 and ends at 2. You can see those numbers on the left edge of the grid container. So what happens is that grid item 6 will now move here. And by default, it's always going to go to the first column. But it's now positioned in the grid row defined by the start line of 1 and the end line of 2. Now, because grid item 6 moves to the slot where number 1 was, it means our other grid items need to move. So grid item 1 now moves to where grid item 2 is, grid item 2 to where grid item 3 is, grid item 3 to where grid item 4 is, grid item 4 to grid item 5, and grid item 5 to where grid item 6 was. So other grid items move automatically when placing a grid item. So we've looked at the grid row property. Let's now look at the grid column property. It follows the same format, where 2/3 now represents the start line and end line of a column. So setting this property will result in grid item 6 moving to this column. That is where the vertical grid line is starting at 2 and ending at 3. So grid item 6 will move here, and this will result in grid item 1 moving back to position 1. So using grid row and grid column allows you to have precise control of where you want grid items to be placed if you want to override the placement of how they appear in the HTML. So let's go play around with this inside VS Code. Alright, so this is where we left off in the previous chapter. I'm going to go just simplify our grid container. There's a lot going on here we don't need. I'm just going to go remove all these properties and change our grid template columns to 200 pixels, just so that they're a bit bigger. I'll refresh, and we're now back to a simple grid, with our 8 grid items in 2 columns. The first thing I want to do is open up DevTools, so we can see our grid lines. So let's move grid item 6 to where grid item 2 is. To do that, I'm going to scroll down to grid item 6. Let's handle grid row first. The start line is 1, and the end line is 2. As we know, our horizontal grid lines are 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and you can see them down the left here. So we want grid item 6 for the row position, starting on grid line 1 and ending on grid line 2. So this will be 1/2. I'll refresh, and grid item 6 has now moved here. As I mentioned before, by default, if no grid column is defined, it will automatically go into the first column of that row. So let's now move it into this column here. We'll grab the grid column property, and we want it starting on grid line 2 and ending on grid line 3. You can see the numbers for our vertical grid lines, 1, 2, and 3. So to do this, we do 2/3. I'll refresh, and you'll now see that grid item 6 has moved from the position here to up here, and the other grid items have moved automatically. So let's now take a look at some placing grid items guidance. Placing grid items is used to achieve specific layouts. Looking at this example here, this kind of layout is common in a feature section, where we have alternating text and image in each row. Grid item 1 is the group text, grid item 2 is the image. This is in the first row. In the second row, the order swaps. So now the image is grid item 4, and the group text is grid item 3 in the second row. The reason this is the case is because in our HTML, it's best practice from a semantic perspective to have text followed by image. So in CSS Grid, we can use the technique of placing grid items to swap the order. For the third row, we would have grid item 5 for the text and grid item 6 for the image. Looking at this web page in mobile now, grid item 1 would be the text, grid item 2 is the image, grid item 3 is the text, and grid item 4 is the image. Now later on in the project, we're going to be learning about media queries and how we can achieve this. But what you'll see is that the grid items need to change position on mobile. Now in actual fact, this positioning is just going to be achieved by just following the order of the HTML. But the grid items are changing position compared to what you see on desktop. If you want to see the implementation of this, you can check out my video on media queries in the description below. So let's now talk about spanning grid cells. Grid row and grid column can be used to have grid items span multiple rows or columns. Let's take a look at what I mean. Let's focus on grid item 1. We'll use the grid column property, where we're going to set the start line to 1 and the end line to 4. So you'll notice this time, the end line is not one increment above the start line, but several increments above. So what this results in is our grid item spanning multiple columns, like this. So grid item 1 is now spanning from the vertical grid line 1 all the way up until the end of the grid container, defined by grid line 4. Now, because grid item 1 is now occupying the grid cell where grid item 2 and 3 are, our grid items need to move. So this is what happens. Grid item 2 is pushed down to where grid item 4 is. Grid item 3 is pushed down to where grid item 5 is. As a result of this, grid item 4 is pushed to where grid item 6 is. Grid item 5 goes on to another row, and grid item 6 also goes onto another row. So because of grid item 1 now spanning the entire row and entering into 2 grid cells, our grid items are moved to another row. Let's take a look at the same setup, but now focusing on the grid row property. Our start line is number 1, and you'll see now instead of an end line, I'm using the special notation of span with a number, where the number is the cells to span. So this is saying start at grid line 1 and span 2 grid cells. So the result will look like this. Our grid item 1 will span 2 grid cells. And just like before, because grid item 1 is now occupying another cell, our grid items need to shift around. Grid item 2 and 3 are fine where they are, but grid item 4 now needs to move to position 5, grid item 5 to position 6, and grid item 6 is going to be moved to another row. Now in reality, for most designs, you just simply wouldn't do this. You would ensure that the number of grid items is correct to achieve the layout you want. So you wouldn't be using 6 grid items here, you'd only be using 5. Let's go play around with this inside VS Code. Alright, so I'm back inside the file we were playing in earlier. I first just want to go remove the placement of grid item 6, just so we can restore everything back in order. So for this demonstration, I want grid item 5 to span 2 rows. So we'll go into grid item 5, we'll grab the grid row property as we want to span 2 grid rows. I'm going to open up DevTools just so we can see our grid lines. So grid item 5, we want starting at grid line 3 over here and ending at grid line 5. So this will be 3/5. I'll refresh and you can see grid item 5 is now spanning these 2 rows. Grid item 6 is where it originally was. Grid item 7 has been pushed from over here to over here. And grid item 8 has been pushed onto a new row. Now this could also be achieved by typing span and the number 2. I'll refresh and you'll see there's no change. Now, as I touched on earlier, in your design, you wouldn't really have this happening with grid item 8 going onto its own row. In actual fact, you just wouldn't have a grid item 8. So I'm going to remove that. I'll refresh and you can see this is the layout we would achieve. So beforehand, you would know your desired outcome in terms of the design you're trying to achieve. And then when you're spanning your grid items, everything will fall into place nicely without grid items being pushed into new rows. So let's take a look at some spanning grid cells guidance. Grid cells can be spanned to create visually interesting designs. Looking at this example over here, we have our grid container. We have a grid item here, over here, and over here. I'm going to add in the grid lines. You can see the 2 grid items stacked on top of each other are spanning 2 columns, whereas the grid item on the right is spanning 2 rows. This kind of grid layout is actually fairly common on the homepage of a lot of tech companies. So let's now talk about aligning grid items. Grid cell alignment can be overridden for individual items. Now, this is not too common, so I wouldn't worry too much about it, but it is important you understand what it is. Let's say we have a grid container, and we apply justify item center and align item center. Inside our grid container, this would result in our grid items being centered inside the grid cells. So what I want to do now is focus on grid item 2, and we're now going to be applying properties to this specific grid item. The first property is justify self with the value of end, and what this does is aligns just grid item 2 along the row axis, overriding the justify item center applied onto the entire grid container. So focus your attention on grid item 2, and you'll see it moves to the end of the grid cell along the row axis. We can also apply the property align self, in this case with the value of start, and this aligns grid item 2 along the column axis, overriding the align item center value applied on the entire grid container. If you focus your attention on grid item 2, it will now move like this. It moves to the start inside the grid cell along the column axis. Now the values you can have for the justify self and align self properties include start, end, center, and stretch, where stretch is the default value. So let's go play around with this inside VS Code. All right, so I'm back in the file we were working on earlier. For this demonstration, I'm just going to go add back in our grid item 8, and I'm going to go remove the grid row property on grid item 5. I'll refresh and we're back to where we started. Now for this demonstration, we need our grid cells to be larger than our grid items. Because our grid cells have a width of 200 pixels and the content number 1 is much smaller than the width of the grid cell, this will work fine horizontally. But for vertically, we need our grid cell to be higher, because the grid cell is just currently the height of the grid item. So to do this, I'm just going to go add some height onto the grid container, and let's make it 400 pixels. So you can see now, if I highlight number 1, there is height inside this grid cell. The background color red is just being stretched by default. So let's go position our grid items in the center of the grid cells. I'll grab the justify items property and set its value to center. I'll refresh, and you can see our grid items are now centered inside the grid cell along the row axis. Let's go center them as well vertically. We'll grab align items, set its value to center. I'll refresh, and you can see our grid items are now also centered vertically inside the grid cell along the column axis. So let's now go use the properties we learned earlier to only move grid item 3 into the top right corner of its grid cell. So for grid item 3, let's first position it along the row axis. We'll grab justify self and set its value to end. I'll refresh, and you can see grid item 3 has now moved to the end of the grid cell along the row axis. To move it to the top right, we'll grab the align self property and set its value to start. I'll refresh, and you can see grid item 3 has now moved to the start of the grid cell along the column axis.
So the justify self and the align self properties are overriding the justify items and align items property set on the grid container. As I mentioned, I wouldn't worry too much about this as it's not too common to do, but you do need to know about it. So let's wrap up this chapter by building a new summary card, grid items. We first looked at placing grid items. Looking at grid item 3, we saw the grid row property places grid items along horizontal grid lines, where the number 1 is the start line, followed by a /, and the number 2 is the end line. The grid column property places grid items along vertical grid lines. So in this case, grid item 3 will stay in the first row, as that's defined by the horizontal grid lines 1 and 2, but it's going to shift its column defined by the vertical grid lines 2 and 3. So grid item 3 is going to move where grid item 2 is. As a result of this, grid item 2 will now move into position 3. We then looked at spanning grid cells. Focusing on grid item 2, we could use the grid column property to span grid item 2 across multiple columns. The number 2 is the start line, and the number 4 is the end line. It's the same notation as placing grid items, but for spanning grid cells, the end line will always be more than one increment above the start line. For this setup, grid item 2 will look like this, starting at the vertical grid line 2 and ending at the vertical grid line 4. Looking now at grid item 3, we can use the grid row property to span multiple rows. In this case, grid item 3 is going to start at the horizontal grid line 1, and we're using the notation here, span with a number, which defines the number of cells to span, in this case 2. So this will result in grid item 3 now spanning 2 columns where it starts at the horizontal grid line 1. The last concept we looked at was aligning grid items, where we saw we could override the alignment of specific grid items. In this case, our grid container has justify items and align items set to center. On grid item 5, we can set the justify self property to end, which will position grid item 5 along the row axis. And in this case, the value is end. So it's going to move grid item 5 to the end of the grid cell along the row axis. We can use the align self property to position the grid item along the column axis. In this case, grid item 5 will be positioned at the start of the grid cell along the column axis. Okay, so let's go use placing grid items to finish off the feature section on our Quill homepage. We have our grid container, our grid items, and in the middle row, we want to place our image where the grouped text is. So I'm back inside the app.css file for our Quill homepage. I'll scroll down to the grid, and we need to move this image over here and this text over here. Now to do this, I'm going to head to the HTML file, and for the middle row, on this image, I'm going to go add a class, so that we can select it and move it. That's this image over here. It currently has a class already, feature-image. We're going to go define a new class, which is feature img swap order. I'll just copy this. I'll head back to app.css. I'll select this class. I'm going to zoom out a bit and open up DevTools so we can see our grid lines. So we want our image over here, which we've just given a new class, to remain in the current grid row, which has a start line of 2 and an end line of 3. And move to this column over here, which has a start line of 1 and an end line of 2. So let's go do the row first. We'll grab the grid row property. It has a start line of 2 and an end line of 3. For the grid column, it has a start line of 1 and an end line of 2. I'll refresh, and you'll see now we've moved this image over here, and as a result, the text is pushed onto the right, with the other grid items unaffected. Now, just to highlight, even though the image remained in the same row, that is, defined by the start line 2 and the end line 3, if I didn't define that, it by default will move up to the top row. Alright, so let's take a look at our page in all its glory. Our hero section is looking great. Our feature section is now looking beautiful with the use of CSS Grid. And our call to action section is also looking superb. If you enjoyed this style of teaching and are looking at mastering CSS, you can join me in my CSS full course, which is available for free on my channel. It's the world's most detailed CSS full course designed for complete beginners and covers everything you need to know to code CSS at a professional level. In the course, you'll experience the same high-quality teaching and build the Quill homepage from scratch. Join me today and also make sure to subscribe to my channel to stay in the loop with new releases. See you in the CSS full course.